wounded. At the LZ, the company began receiving heavy small arms fire. The command element around Sergeant Friedman was devastated. The situation demanded rapid action. Sergeant Friedman grabbed a radio and took command of the company. He called in helicopter gunships, coordinated supporting arms, and reorganized his defenses. The helicopter pilots flying above the battle were amazed at his coolness under fire. Under Sergeant Friedman's competent command, the perimeter held all night, and the enemy eventually withdrew. Stepping up. Lessons. Sergeant Freeman, a well-trained NCO, was prepared to lead his company in combat. He knew the techniques and procedures for air support, supporting arms, medevac, and company defensive positions. And they kind of rattle that off. And one thing that the Marine Corps does really good in this manual is they hit on the fact that you got to have the skills. You got to have these fundamental skills of combat leadership. The technical and tactical skills of combat leadership, meaning how to call for air support, how to call for supporting arms, how to call for artillery, how to call for medevac. These are technical skills that you have to have. And they reinforce that throughout this book. So if you're in a leadership position and you think, well, I'm not going to have to do that. No, actually, you better go and dig in and figure out how to do these things. In addition to his technical knowledge, he was able to match these abilities with strong leadership and cool competence in the face of disaster. Because of his experience and situational awareness, Sergeant Freeman knew that rapid action was required. Once again, what do we see? We see someone that's taking action. He immediately took control of the situation, making decisions and issuing orders, and extricated his company from a perilous situation. And here's a little Clausewitz on war, which we haven't covered yet. It's sort of one of those ones. Is it like not playing the obvious one? We haven't done that one yet. The end for which a soldier is recruited, armed, and trained, the whole object of his sleeping, eating, drinking, and marching is simply that he should fight at the right place and at the right time. Check. All right. Now, here we go. So this section that I'm about to read actually came earlier in the manual, and I pulled it out and I put it at the end. This is the last one of these examples. And there's a reason why, and it immediately struck me when I saw it. So the title of this section is just Sergeant First Class. U.S. Army, Vietnam, 1966. So as soon as I read that, I was kind of surprised because all the other ones, they give the person's name. So I'm thinking, why aren't they saying this guy's name? Is this a top secret mission? Well, no, this is 1998. There was no more secret missions. So why aren't we explaining this? And it becomes obvious when I read it why they just called this individual Sergeant First Class. So here we go. In May of 1966, C Company of 1st Battalion, 12th Cavalry, 1st Cavalry Division established a mortar fire base at LZ Hereford in the Vinh Phan Valley. So this is actually part of, and I'll get into this, this is part of that earlier operation that we mentioned. The position was 150 meters long and 40 meters wide. The upper slope was covered in 6-foot-high elephant grass. The mortar section was led by a Sergeant First Class, no name given. His position lay on a hill which had previously been occupied by Viet Cong guerrillas. He formed his men in a weak perimeter. We're not off to a good start. Arranged in a U shape with the curve facing uphill, and set up the mortars in order to provide support for the company. The main body of the company went off to patrol the valley below, leaving the 22-man mortar section to defend their own position. The men fired off a few rounds to seat their base plates. The sergeant decided to give the men a break and did not order anyone to dig in or examine the area around the perimeter. No security patrols were sent out. The men lounged, ate sea rations, and walked around in the open. In the jungle heat, it seemed like a day at the beach. At 13:30 An enemy machine gun opened up at a range of 50 meters from the elephant grass uphill of the mortar position. A 200-man unit of VC had been waiting to ambush the lax mortar unit. Machine gun fire was followed by rifle fire and grenade attacks. The rest of the company, which had gone down the hill on patrol, the rest of the company took 35 minutes to rush back to the devastated mortar position. The enemy had withdrawn and left only a handful of dazed survivors. The failure of the sergeant to properly lead his unit, enforce basic security measures, or prepare for enemy contact led directly to disaster. With its support element eliminated, the company was not able to establish its patrol mission, which in turn negatively affected the battalion's mission in the Vinh Thanh Valley. So I read that, and of course I think about, okay, what does this mean? And they hadn't given away any names, right? So they didn't give this guy's name, but they had given away a date, May of 1966. They'd given away the LZ Hereford. So I start to do some research, and it turns out that this specific battle was written about in a book on Vietnam called Battles in the Monsoon. And this is an out-of-print book. But I was really curious, well, what happened? Like, what happened? So I found this out-of-print book, ordered it. And the book, Battles in the Monsoon, is a book full of basically a bunch of short little stories. And this particular story, this particular section in this book about this battle is called Men Facing Death. So let's hear a little bit more detail about this situation. By the way, this is all Operation Crazy Horse. By the night of 21 May, the Battle of Vinh Thanh Valley appeared to be slowing to a stop, with the enemy fractionalized and everyone running for cover. Landing zone Hereford, that well-worked over slope where the initial explosion had occurred, and I'm skipping to this specific. They give a little bit of background. This LZ Hereford had been used a bunch. It looked like one of the safest places in the fire zone. Such had been the consistency of armed traffic in and out of it. So this was a LZ that was getting used all the time. That was about how Colonel John J. Hennessy thought of it when he decided on a special mission for Charlie Company, 1st to the 12th for the following morning. It was a courteous gesture, the main object being to return Charlie Company to its parent battalion. But before doing so, Hennessy planned to ask a small favor in return. The company, under Captain Don F. Warren, a taciturn Georgian who had been with his same unit since winning his gold bars in 1961. So this guy's been in the same unit for 5 straight years. He was on the perimeter on Hill 766, several ridges beyond Hereford. The airline distance was about 3,000 meters. Hennessy directed Warren to sweep back over the high ground to Hereford after sunup. Unworried about that passage, he was most concerned that Charlie Company should reconnoiter the lower slopes beyond the landing zone, which thus far no one had prowled. That task done, it could rejoin the battalion in the valley not far away. Hennessy had no reason to be suspicious. He was merely being cautious. The ground around Hereford had not been worked over carefully for several days. Captain Jack Cummings and Alpha Company were in perimeter on the landing zone at this same hour. They were not left wholly undisturbed, but the occasional sniper rounds and grenades that innocuously bit into their ground were attributed to enemy stragglers. So there's a company there. They're getting hit occasionally, but there's just a bunch of stragglers is what they're assuming. Alpha Company needed to be back, so they send in Charlie Company. Word of that was afoot, and that reached Major Charles Seiler at Anke shortly after Hennessy gave his order. The division's public information officer was entertaining a visitor and a weighing problem all his own. Belatedly drawn by the news that Operation Crazy Horse was racking up a score, war correspondent Sam Kasten, a 32-year-old senior editor of Look magazine, had just arrived in camp, pursuing a theme worthy of Hemingway. Kasten was the only correspondent drawn to the battle. He said to Seiler, "I wish to know the thoughts of men facing death." So that's what this war correspondent says, Sam Kasten. Seiler voiced an honest doubt that the quest was logical, men's fears and reflections not being all of one kind, and the soldier hardly knowing how he thinks about death until he feels he is dying. It is just not the subject that makes for easy talk among combat men. So that's kind of weird, right? We got this reporter saying, hey, I want to go get some men facing death. At the time, General Norton had put the on-K position on semi-alert, and the whole camp was astir. Seiler and his staff were in the bunkers around the press camp, realigning some of the sandbags. "You don't have to worry about this ground tonight," said Kasten. "I'm the luckiest reporter alive. Wherever I go, nothing happens." So even this guy who's looking for problems, he's got that attitude where I'm going to go look for problems and I'm not going to find them. Seiler remembered the words, thinking them slightly ironic in view of what Kasten was looking for. This guy wants to go find people facing death, but then he says, "Yeah, don't worry about there going to be any problems because I'm so lucky that nothing's going to happen." "There's a big hill not far from here where a lot of men have died in the last few days," he said. "Then I want to get up there first thing in the morning," said Kasten. "And by the way, I intend to follow the subject all the way through, see the coffins in which you place the bodies." "We put them in rubber bags," said Seiler grumly, hoping to close the conversation, but Kasten continued to fret about getting up to Hereford soon after dawn. Seiler broke off work to arrange for Kasten's certain departure. These were the circumstances which resulted in Kasten being delivered to Hereford by the same helicopter that carried ammunition, coffee, and a hot breakfast to Cummings and Alpha Company. His first hours were unrewarding, that the unit was too busy stacking supply equipment for an early getaway to talk with Kasten about death. Besides, the morning was disarmingly fair and quiet. Warren and Charlie Company, meanwhile, were beating their way along the ridge. On the way back from Hill 766, having broken camp at 1000, a fairly wide trail runs from the top of the scarp for the entire distance. So, fast forward a little bit. Alpha Company was lifted from LZ Hereford when Charlie Company arrived at high noon. Kasten stayed. On the landing zone, Warren talked briefly to Lieutenant Colonel Rutland P. Beard, Jr., the battalion commander, and his S3 major role. It was arranged that Warren and the main body of the company would continue their stroll downslope through the trees and across the river. Now, I just want to call out these words. It was arranged, because we're going to get some more information. So you've got the battalion commander talking to the company commander, and they come to this is what it says. It was arranged that Warren and the main body of the company would continue through the stroll through the downslope, through the trees and across the river. The mortar platoon would remain on Hereford to cover its further advance with fire from the 81 millimeter tube. So now you can see where we're going. The Sergeant First Class of the mortar platoon that we talked about from the squad leader makes a difference. This is the guy. This is the guy. The platoon, 22 strong, was led by Sergeant Robert L. Kirby, a 29-year-old Negro from Los Angeles. Slight of frame, solemn-faced, Kirby is rated one of the stoutest hearted fighters in his brigade. So that's a little different, right? Now we're calling this guy one of the stoutest hearted fighters in the brigade, but in the reflections from the manual, he's not going to do a good job. And by the way, he's going to get left with 22 people in a mortar platoon, which is, again, we'll dive more into that. Few in numbers, his men seemed sufficiently armed. Each carried 300 more rounds for their M16s and from 2 to 4 hand grenades. The one heavy weapon was the 81 millimeter mortar, for which Kirby had only 18 rounds. That with the tube was as much weight as the men could carry. So sufficiently armed is an interesting way of saying it. Because we know that an M16 with 300 rounds, an M16